The restaurant was the kind of place people talked about in whispers. Crystal glasses caught the light like diamonds. Soft music floated through the air. Every table was filled with well-dressed guests who looked like they belonged there, tailored suits, elegant dresses, confident laughter. This was not a place you entered by accident. It was a place where appearance mattered, where status was noticed before names were ever spoken. Then the doors opened. A man stepped inside who didn't seem to fit the picture. He wore simple clothes. No designer labels. No flashy watch. His posture was relaxed, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He paused for a moment, taking in the room, not impressed, not intimidated, just observant. A few heads turned, then turned away just as quickly. At first, no one paid much attention, until the waiter noticed him. The waiter's eyes moved over the man slowly, from his shoes to his jacket, then back up again. There was a pause. A smirk. The kind of look that comes from someone who believes they already know everything they need to know about you. The man approached a table near the center of the restaurant. A good table, one that usually came with assumptions. Before he could even sit down, the waiter spoke. His voice was loud enough to carry, sharp enough to cut through the music. "You can't sit there." The room didn't go silent, but something shifted. Nearby conversations softened. A few guests glanced over their shoulders. The waiter didn't stop there. He gestured at the man's clothes, his tone dripping with sarcasm, making sure the message landed not just on the man, but on everyone listening. "This section is reserved," he said, smiling. "For people who actually belong here." A couple of guests exchanged looks. Someone let out an uncomfortable laugh. The waiter straightened his posture, enjoying the moment. This wasn't just a correction, it was a performance, a public judgment. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look embarrassed. He simply stood there, calm and still, meeting the waiter's eyes for a brief moment. There was no anger in his expression. No confusion. Just a quiet focus that felt strangely out of place in the middle of the waiter's smug confidence. That calm should have been a warning, but the waiter mistook silence for weakness. What he didn't know, what no one in that room realized yet, was that this moment would change everything. That the laughter, the whispers, the assumptions hanging in the air were about to turn into something else entirely. Because the man standing there wasn't who he appeared to be. And before the night was over, the entire restaurant would understand just how badly he had been misjudged. The restaurant itself was a world built on reputation. Everything about it whispered exclusivity. From the moment guests stepped inside, they were surrounded by polished marble floors, low golden lighting, and the quiet confidence of a place that never needed to advertise. Reservations were booked weeks in advance. Prices were never listed outside. If you had to ask how much something cost, you probably didn't belong there. This was where deals were finalized, alliances were formed, and reputations were quietly reinforced over carefully plated meals. The tables were spaced just far enough apart to suggest privacy, yet close enough for people to notice who was sitting where. Certain seats carried unspoken meaning. The closer you were to the center of the room, the more important you were assumed to be. Corners were for observers. The best tables were for those everyone already respected or feared. Tonight, the room was full of that kind of confidence. Men in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs, speaking softly but firmly, the kind of voices used by people who were used to being listened to. Women in elegant dresses moved with effortless poise, their laughter measured, controlled. Watches glinted under the lights. Expensive handbags rested casually at chair legs, treated like ordinary items rather than symbols of wealth. The staff moved quickly and precisely, trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken. They didn't just serve food, they enforced the atmosphere. Every movement was polished. Every smile was calculated. Their job was not only to provide service, but to protect the image of the place. This restaurant had rules, most of them unspoken. It rewarded those who looked successful and quietly punished those who didn't. Appearances mattered. Clothing mattered. Confidence mattered. And above all, the approval of the staff mattered, because they were the gatekeepers of who belonged and who didn't. Over time, that kind of environment created a certain culture. A culture where people began to believe that wealth made them superior. Where politeness was optional if you thought you were above someone else. Where judgment came quickly, and humility was rare. The restaurant didn't just serve fine dining, it fed egos. Tonight was no different. As guests settled in, there was a subtle energy in the air, the kind that comes from a room full of people who all believed they were important. Conversations drifted between business strategies, investments, and stories of success. There was laughter, but it carried an edge, a quiet competition even among those sitting at the same table. In a place like this, everyone watched everyone else. Not openly, but enough to measure status, to compare, to silently rank the room. And that was why the man's presence felt so strange. He didn't match the rhythm of the place. He didn't rush. He didn't scan the room nervously or straighten his clothes. He didn't try to appear confident. He simply was. His calm didn't fit the restaurant's carefully constructed hierarchy, and that made him stand out more than any designer suit ever could. Some guests noticed him without realizing why. A woman paused mid-sentence, glancing in his direction before continuing her conversation. A man at a nearby table frowned briefly, then dismissed the thought. The staff, however, noticed immediately. They were trained to. They had learned to read people quickly and make decisions just as fast. And in this culture, decisions were often made on site alone. The restaurant prided itself on being exclusive, but exclusivity had slowly turned into something else: entitlement. The belief that respect was something you earned by looking the part, not by how you carried yourself. That belief shaped how people were treated, how rules were enforced, and how mistakes were made. Especially mistakes like the one unfolding now. Because in a place where image ruled everything, the greatest irony was this: true power didn't always announce itself. It didn't need attention. It didn't need validation. And yet in this room, very few people understood that. As the waiter moved through the space with practiced confidence, the atmosphere remained unchanged on the surface, refined, elegant, controlled. But underneath, something fragile was forming. A tension born from assumptions. A situation built entirely on misjudgment. The kind of situation that only becomes clear when it's already too late. And if you were sitting in that restaurant at that moment, watching quietly from your table, you might have felt it too. That subtle sense that this night was not going to end the way anyone expected. Have you ever seen someone judged instantly, only for the truth to surprise everyone? The waiter had been working there long enough to believe the restaurant belonged to him. He moved through the room with an exaggerated confidence, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, eyes constantly scanning for anything out of place. Years of serving wealthy guests had taught him one thing: power in this space didn't come from kindness. It came from control, from deciding who deserved respect and who didn't. And in his mind, that decision had already been made. He returned to the man's table, not with a menu, but with an attitude sharpened by assumption. His steps were slow, deliberate, meant to draw attention. A few nearby guests noticed and leaned back slightly, sensing another moment of quiet drama unfolding. The waiter stopped just short of the table and sighed loudly. "I already told you," he said, his voice carrying far enough for others to hear. "This area isn't for walk-ins." The man looked up calmly, his expression unchanged. "I have a reservation," he replied simply. The waiter let out a short laugh, not amused, mocking. "A reservation," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Sir, this isn't that kind of place." A couple of guests glanced over now, no longer pretending not to listen. The waiter glanced around as well, aware of his audience. He straightened, feeding off the attention. "You see," he continued, gesturing vaguely around the room, "people here expect a certain standard, and when someone ignores that, it creates confusion." His eyes flicked again to the man's clothes. Unnecessary confusion. The words were sharp, carefully chosen to sting without sounding openly cruel, but the intent was clear. This wasn't about a table. It was about humiliation. The man didn't react. That only irritated the waiter more. "I'm trying to save you some embarrassment," the waiter said, his tone now dripping with false politeness. "There are plenty of other restaurants nearby, places that might be more comfortable for you." Someone at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably. Another guest cleared their throat. A woman shook her head slightly, though she said nothing. The waiter noticed none of it, or chose not to. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound confidential while still being heard. "Look around," he said. "Do you really think you belong here?" That was the moment the insult fully landed. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't professional. It was personal. The room felt tighter, as if the walls had moved closer. Conversations had stopped entirely now. Silverware rested untouched. All eyes were drawn to the same quiet confrontation. The man stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, listening without interruption. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain. His calm was unwavering, and somehow that only fueled the waiter's confidence. Mistaking silence for surrender, the waiter pushed further. "If you don't leave willingly," he said, his voice rising again, "I'll have security escort you out. We can't have just anyone wandering in here." The threat hung in the air. This was no longer about policy. It was about dominance, about proving authority in front of a room full of witnesses. A few guests exchanged glances, silently questioning whether the waiter had gone too far. But no one intervened. In places like this, people learn to mind their own business, especially when they believe the person being targeted had no power. The waiter waited for a reaction. None came. Instead, the man slowly looked around the room, not nervously but thoughtfully, as if he were taking note of something deeper than the situation itself. Then his gaze returned to the waiter, steady and composed. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. The words were calm, controlled, almost gentle, but they carried weight. The waiter's smile faded for just a split second before returning, tighter now. "Then you're making this harder than it needs to be," he replied. "For yourself." There was a sense, subtle but unmistakable, that the waiter believed he had already won, that he had exposed someone who didn't belong, that the room was on his side. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't a confrontation built on noise or force. It was built on patience, and patience, when paired with quiet confidence, had a way of turning arrogance into regret. The man did not move. He didn't cross his arms. He didn't clench his jaw. He didn't shift his weight or glance toward the exit. While the tension in the room thickened, he remained exactly where he was, calm in a way that felt almost unsettling. His silence was not empty. It was deliberate. The waiter stood there, waiting for something, an apology, an argument, embarrassment, anything that would confirm his belief that he was in control. But the man gave him nothing. He simply met the waiter's gaze, steady and unflinching, as if he were listening to something far deeper than the words being spoken. That calm began to feel heavy. People often mistook restraint for weakness. The waiter was no different. To him, silence meant surrender. It meant uncertainty. It meant someone who didn't know how to fight back. And yet, there was something about the man's posture that didn't align with that assumption. His shoulders were relaxed, but not slouched. His expression was neutral, but not vacant. He looked like someone who had nothing to prove. That was what made it dangerous. The man slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. Not abruptly, not defiantly, just naturally, as if the decision had already been made long before the confrontation began. The sound of the chair touching the floor echoed, louder than it should have in the suddenly quiet room. A few guests inhaled sharply. The waiter blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People usually protested, they argued. They tried to explain themselves. This man had done none of that. He had simply claimed the space without permission, without announcement, without fear. The waiter cleared his throat, irritation creeping into his voice. "Sir," he said again, more sharply this time, "I told you. I heard you." The man replied calmly. Two simple words spoken softly, but they stopped the waiter mid-sentence. There was no hostility in his tone, no challenge, just acknowledgement, as if the waiter's words had been received, weighed, and quietly dismissed. The man rested his hands on the table, fingers loosely interlaced. He looked around briefly, not at the guests, not at the staff, but at the room itself. At the walls, the lighting, the careful symmetry. It was the look of someone who understood the place completely, even if no one understood him. The waiter felt it then. A subtle shift. The confidence he'd been riding on suddenly felt thinner, less solid. The longer the man stayed silent, the more exposed the waiter felt. It was as though the attention of the entire room had slowly moved, not toward the insult, but toward the response that never came. Or rather, the response that didn't need to. The man didn't defend himself because he didn't feel attacked. He didn't argue because he didn't feel accused. He didn't raise his voice because he didn't feel powerless. His calm wasn't an act, it was a position. And positions like that didn't collapse easily. A few guests began to sense it too. The tension in their shoulders eased, replaced by curiosity. This was no longer about a rude waiter and a misplaced guest. Something else was unfolding. Something quieter, something more controlled. The waiter shifted his stance, adjusting his uniform as if it might restore his authority. "You're causing a scene," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had moments earlier. The man looked up at him again. "This isn't a scene," he replied evenly. "It's a misunderstanding." There was no accusation in his words, no attempt to embarrass. If anything, it sounded like an offer, an opportunity to step back, to correct course, the kind of opportunity people only recognize in hindsight. But the waiter didn't take it. He scoffed lightly, masking his unease. "I'll get the manager," he said. "We'll see how long this calm attitude lasts." He turned to leave, but hesitated, glancing back one last time as if expecting the man to call after him. To plead, to explain, to show some sign of vulnerability. None came. The man remained seated unbothered, his attention returning to the empty table in front of him. Around him, the restaurant held its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The usual sounds, the clinking glasses, the low conversations had vanished. In their place was a stillness that felt intentional. The kind of stillness that comes before something irreversible. And as the waiter walked away, unaware of how small he now appeared, one thing became increasingly clear to those watching closely. This man's power was not in what he said. It was in what he didn't need to say at all. The room no longer felt like a restaurant. It felt like a pause. People sat frozen in their chairs, hands resting where they had stopped moments earlier. Glasses hovered just above tables. Forks remained untouched. The easy rhythm of conversation that once filled the space had vanished, replaced by an uneasy awareness that something important was unfolding, and no one wanted to miss it. Whispers began to travel, not loudly, not boldly, just enough to be noticed. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "I've never seen him before," another replied. A woman leaned toward her companion, lowering her voice. "Look at how calm he is." That calm was impossible to ignore now. It spread through the room like a quiet pressure, forcing people to pay attention whether they wanted to or not. The man remained seated, composed, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. He looked nothing like someone waiting to be removed. If anything, he looked like someone waiting for time to catch up. The staff felt it too. A junior server slowed near the edge of the room, pretending to straighten silverware while watching carefully. Another staff member paused near the bar, eyes flicking between the seated man and the hallway where the waiter had disappeared. Even those trained to remain neutral couldn't hide their discomfort. Something was wrong. Not wrong in a loud, obvious way, but wrong in the way assumptions feel when they begin to crack. A guest near the window shifted in his seat, glancing around as if seeking confirmation from others. He wasn't alone. Several guests exchanged looks, eyebrows raised, expressions questioning. The confidence that once filled the room had begun to thin, replaced by uncertainty. Why hadn't the man reacted? Why hadn't he argued? Why did he seem so prepared? Time stretched. Seconds felt longer than they should have. The kind of stretch where people become acutely aware of small details. The hum of the lights, the faint clink of glass from the bar, the sound of someone clearing their throat a few tables away. The waiter was gone longer than expected. That absence mattered. If this had been routine, it would have been quick. A brief explanation, a swift resolution. Instead, the delay fed the tension. It suggested discussion, consideration, something more complicated than a simple mistake. A guest near the center table leaned back and crossed his arms. "This doesn't feel right," he whispered. Another nodded. "Not at all." The man at the table remained motionless but aware. He sensed the shift without acknowledging it. His calm hadn't changed, but the room around him had. The same people who had watched silently before were now watching intently, as if trying to read the ending before it arrived. The waiter returned briefly, passing through the edge of the room. His face looked different now, less certain. His steps, once confident, were measured. He avoided eye contact as he moved past the guests, heading back toward the hallway. That alone was enough to change everything. The whispers grew slightly louder. "Did you see his face? He looks nervous." Why would he be nervous? The room no longer saw a misplaced guest. They saw a mystery. Some guests felt embarrassed, not for the man but for themselves. For having assumed, for having watched without speaking. Others felt curiosity sharpen into anticipation. Whatever this was, it was no longer ordinary. Even the air felt heavier. The man adjusted slightly in his chair, resting his hands more comfortably on the table. The movement was subtle, unhurried, but it drew attention. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt final, like the calm before a door opened. Someone near the back exhaled slowly. "Something's about to happen," they whispered, and they were right. Because whatever judgment had been made at the door, whatever confidence had fueled the insult, it was unraveling now, piece by piece, in full view of everyone who had chosen to watch instead of speak. The room waited. Not with excitement, but with realization. The kind that arrives too late to stop what comes next. And just before the truth would finally step into the open, one thought passed silently through the minds of many in that restaurant. They had all underestimated him. Comment below, like the video, and share it with someone who believes respect. The manager entered quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no raised voice, no sudden command for attention. He stepped into the room from the hallway with measured confidence, his expression serious, his posture upright. Yet the effect was immediate. Staff members straightened instinctively. A few guests recognized him and fell silent without realizing they had been speaking. The waiter appeared beside him, noticeably different from before. His shoulders were tense. His earlier arrogance had faded into something restrained, almost cautious. He leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice, gesturing toward the table at the center of the room. The manager listened without interrupting, his eyes already fixed on the seated man. Then he stopped walking. For a brief moment, he simply stood there looking. Something changed in his expression, not shock, not fear, but recognition. The kind that arrives instantly, without effort, as if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. He took a step forward, then another. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of hesitation, but because of awareness. Conversations didn't just fade now, they ceased entirely. The room had gone completely still. Every guest sensed that this was the moment everything had been leading toward. The manager reached the table and stopped. "Sir," he said quietly. The man looked up. Their eyes met. The manager's tone shifted instantly, stripped of authority and replaced with something far more telling: respect. Steven Seagal. The name didn't echo loudly. It didn't need to. It landed. A ripple moved through the room like a sudden breath being taken all at once. Heads turned sharply. Eyes widened. Whispers burst free, no longer restrained. "That's him." "Wet Steven Seagal."
No way.
The waiter froze. His face drained of color. His confident posture collapsed into stiffness, as if his body had forgotten how to stand naturally. He stared at the man he had just insulted, the realization hitting him not gradually, but all at once. The pieces clicked together brutally. The calm, the silence, the refusal to explain. It hadn't been weakness. It had been certainty. The manager stepped closer to the table, lowering his voice but making sure the words were unmistakable. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said. "This should never have happened." Steven remained seated. He didn't smile. He didn't look around to absorb the attention. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the apology without demanding it. The contrast was striking. All around them, guests watched with a mix of awe and discomfort. Some looked embarrassed, others impressed. A few lowered their gaze, suddenly aware of their own earlier assumptions. The waiter swallowed hard. I didn't know." He stammered, his voice barely audible now. Steven looked at him calmly. He replied. 2 words again. Simple. Direct. Devastating. The manager turned to the waiter, his expression controlled but firm. There was no anger in his eyes, only disappointment. "Step away," he said quietly. The waiter obeyed immediately, moving back as if afraid to remain too close. The manager then addressed Steven once more. "Your table is ready," he said. And again, "I'm truly sorry." Steven stood slowly. The movement drew every eye in the room. He didn't rush. He didn't make a show of it. He rose with the same composed presence he had carried since the moment he entered. "I didn't come here for apologies," he said evenly. "I came here for a meal." There was no edge in his voice. No satisfaction, just truth. The manager nodded. Of course. As Steven was guided toward the table, the room parted subtly, guests instinctively making space. No one spoke. No one laughed. The energy that once felt arrogant now felt humbled. The waiter remained where he stood, staring at the floor. He had tried to assert power and discovered how little he truly had. And the rest of the room had just learned the same lesson. Because in a place built on status, where appearance had been mistaken for worth, the greatest authority had entered quietly, spoken gently, and changed everything without raising his voice. The reveal was complete, and nothing in that restaurant would ever feel quite the same again. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He didn't take advantage of the silence that now followed him like a shadow. As he settled at the table, his movements were calm, deliberate, almost ordinary. Yet everything around him had changed. The restaurant felt different now, smaller, quieter, more honest. The manager stood nearby, hands folded, respectfully waiting. The staff watched from a distance, careful not to intrude. Guests who once seemed untouchable now avoided eye contact, suddenly aware of how quickly confidence could turn into discomfort. Steven looked up at the waiter. The young man stood a few steps away, shoulders tense, eyes lowered. The arrogance that had filled him earlier was gone, replaced by something raw and unsettled. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't proud. He was afraid not of punishment, but of what he had revealed about himself. Steven studied him for a moment, not with judgment, but with understanding. "Come here," he said quietly. The waiter hesitated, then stepped forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. The entire room watched, expecting something dramatic: anger, consequences. Humiliation returned in full. None of that came. "You did your job the way you thought you were supposed to," Steven said calmly. "That doesn't make you evil, but it does mean you stopped seeing people." The waiter swallowed, nodding slightly. "In places like this," Steven continued, his voice steady, "it's easy to confuse appearance with value. Easy to believe respect is something you give only to those who look important." He paused, letting the words settle. "But respect doesn't work that way." The waiter finally looked up, eyes glassy, face tight with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I judged you, I was wrong." Steven nodded once. "Learn from it," he replied.
That's enough.
There was no demand for punishment. No public shaming. No victory speech. Just a clear line drawn between arrogance and growth. The manager exhaled slowly, relieved. Several guests shifted in their seats, the tension easing at last. What could have ended in spectacle had become something quieter and far more powerful. Stephen turned his attention back to the table. The meal was served. Plates were set down carefully, respectfully. The staff moved differently now, not with fear, but with awareness. Every gesture felt more human, less rehearsed. Around the room, conversations resumed, but not as before. Voices were lower. Laughter was softer. People spoke with an edge of reflection, glancing occasionally towards Stephen, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect. Some guests felt humbled. Others felt exposed. A few felt grateful for having witnessed a moment that reminded them how easily judgment can blind and how rare true composure really is. Stephen ate quietly, unbothered by the attention he no longer received. He didn't need it. He never had. His presence had already done its work. By the time he finished, the restaurant had learned something it would never advertise on its walls: that power doesn't announce itself, that dignity doesn't require approval, and that the strongest response to arrogance is not anger but restraint. When Stephen finally stood to leave, the room noticed again, not because he demanded it, but because people chose to. Chairs shifted. Conversations paused. A few guests nodded respectfully as he passed. He acknowledged none of it. At the door, he paused briefly, glancing back at the room, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet certainty that the lesson had landed where it needed to. Then he stepped out into the night. Inside, the restaurant slowly returned to life. But something fundamental had changed. The staff moved with greater care. The guests carried themselves with a touch more humility. And the memory of that calm, controlled moment lingered, long after the plates were cleared. Because everyone there understood now. You never really know who you're standing in front of. And judging someone by appearances can cost you more than respect. It can cost you the chance to grow. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments.